You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, he has written a book about what could arguably be called, and I think without much pushback, but we'll get into that, the most dispositive battle in the history of the United States of America, and that is the Battle of Saratoga. The author is Kevin J. Weddle. His book is The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution. Professor Weddle, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Robert. It's great to be here.
You know, Professor Weddle graduated from West Point. He served in the Army for 28 years. He was in Operation Desert Storm and Enduring Freedom. He retired as a colonel. He has written other books. I got sent this copy by his publishing house. They were very kind to send it my way. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much, not only because the American Revolution is so intoxicating, but because you paid so much attention to the British side of this battle, strategically and tactically. You also introduced a term that I didn't really know, other than it meaning luggage, and that's grip.
Right.
I want to start off there because it runs through your book.
Okay.
What is grip, and why is it important and pertinent to this battle?
Okay. Well, number one, thank you again for hosting me. And I love talking about this campaign because I think it's one of, as you said, I mean, it's clearly one of the most pivotal campaigns in American history. And you can certainly argue that it was the most pivotal campaign in American history. The notion of grip, I got that from reading a book about Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British Field Marshal in World War II. And because I do a lot of World War II things, I take groups to Normandy. In fact, I'm taking a group to Normandy here in a couple of weeks. So I do that all the time. And so I'm constantly trying to read more and more about that every time I take these folks out. And I came across his notion of grip. And he had this idea of grip being, and it really is a very Montgomeryan kind of notion because he was a very micromanaging kind of guy, very much attention to detail. And so that was the nicest thing he could say about one of his subordinate commanders, that they had grip. And what that meant to Montgomery was they knew down to the nitty gritty about all the logistics in their unit and how many, days of supply that they had, how much ammunition they had, where all the units were, what's the strength. Montgomery could walk into their headquarters and ask him, how many days of ammunition do you have? Well, I've got 6.5 days of ammunition and da-da-da-da-da. And so he would say that commander has grip. And so I kind of like the idea, and I like the name grip. I mean, that just sounds, very, very military. It sounds like if you have grip, you must be a good commander. But what I did with the notion of grip is I said, yeah, that's very good. It's good to have that. Commanders should have that. But it's kind of a tactical notion. It's sort of all commanders should have grip. They should all know that kind of thing. But I took it up a little bit higher and I said, well, what about, though, a commander who's got more than the Montgomeryan notion of grip? What about a commander who has more of an intuition and feel for the battlefield? Somebody like a Alexander the Great or a Patton or a Napoleon, somebody who can visualize how a campaign is going to play out And so so I took it a little bit farther. And so I use that as one of the things I use to evaluate all these different leaders, their leadership, all these senior people in the Saratoga campaign. And so if you look at my book, the two threads that kind of weave themselves throughout the book, at least what I tried to do, is weave leadership and also strategy throughout the book. And one of the tools I used to evaluate leadership was this notion of grip.
Let's set the stage. This is your book starts obviously before the twin battles of Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights in 1777. Let's set the stage just a little bit because I want to get back to leadership and strategy.
Sure.
Because you dissect the leaders in a way that, and I've read, a few books. Richard Ketchum, I think, had a book on Saratoga and a couple others.
Excellent book.
It'd been a while, and I really enjoyed how you sort of peeled the layers off, especially on the personalities. But it's 17, we'll just start. It's 1776. It's December. Washington has crossed the Delaware. He's attacked Trenton and then wins. I think that's a fair way to put it. Wins the Battle of Princeton.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But what's going on in the Middle Atlantic colonies and the New England colonies as it relates both to operations in the United States or in America in the region and in Canada, because Canada is kind of this shadow character throughout your movie or throughout your book that plays an important role.
Yeah, it sure does. Well, there's a couple different things going on. Not only has Washington kind of stopped the bleeding of his army that was starting to just disappear with these twin victories at Trenton and Princeton that you already mentioned, but also the British had attempted in the fall of 1776 an invasion into upstate New York from Canada. So they had the commander-in-chief up there, General Sir Guy Carleton, who was also kind of dual-hatted as also the governor of Canada, the British governor of Canada, had led a force down the St. Lawrence and then down into Lake Champlain and then headed south on Lake Champlain. His idea was to ultimately take the American fortress at Fort Ticonderoga. But he never gets that far. He gets as far as Crown Point, which is about 9-10 miles north of Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. And the Americans and the weather really kind of turn him back. It's more the weather than the Americans, really. They do fight the famous naval battle of Valcour Island on his way south on Lake Champlain. But the campaigning season is getting late. It's getting into October. It's almost into November. And he decides that he's not going to be able to pull off a whole lot. So he decides to go back to Canada. So that was the British High Command back in London saw that as a huge missed opportunity. And so they were not pleased with Carleton's performance during that fall campaign. But the Americans were happy about that. They were able to stop this invasion coming down from Canada. Washington's able to, again, kind of stop the bleeding with those twin battles of Trenton and Princeton. And so the British started to say, well, look, we've got to do something different. We've got to come up with a new strategy for 1777. We've been screwing around long enough. Let's end this thing and let's come up with a war-winning strategy for 1777. And that's what they start doing in early 1777. For Washington's part, for the Americans' part, they're looking to kind of shore up the army and to continue to defend up in upstate New York, up near Fort Ticonderoga for any possible follow-on invasions coming down from Canada. And then Washington's also looking very closely at General Howe, the British commander-in-chief, who's got the main army in New York. So Washington's watching him. They've got another army up in New York that's kind of watching the northern flank up there. And there's not really much going on in New England at this time in terms of actual military operations going on.
Why was this segment, this geographical area of the colonies so important? You mentioned Valcour Island, Fort Ticonderoga.
Right.
St. Lawrence River. Obviously, the Hudson River is kind of
Right.
almost, the rock, paper, and scissors of the whole campaign. But what was it
Absolutely.
about this area that made it a concentration point for the British?
Right. Well, in part, it's because they're able to seize New York, the great harbor of New York. I mean, that was really important. They wanted that as a base. So they're able to do that. Of course, we know that in, late summer, early fall 1776, they kick Washington off Long Island and Manhattan. They're able to seize New York. But then you hit on it. The key was Hudson's River. They called it Hudson's River. They called it the North River, but we know it today as the Hudson River. So they saw that as really important because if you look at the kind of the traditional invasion route to and from Canada was Lake Champlain, Hudson River, either going north or coming south. And so they wanted to take control of the Hudson River. The British thought that if they could seize control of the Hudson River Valley and the Hudson River all the way up to Albany and even beyond, if they could seize control of that area, they'd be able to split off the American colonies. They still consider them colonies, of course. By this time, it's states, but they want to basically break the revolution in half. They think that the most dangerous part of the American colonies are the New England colonies. They're the most rebellious. And they think that the rest of the American colonies, mid-Atlantic colonies from, New York south, they're less rebellious. They have more loyalists there. So they think that if they can break the Americans in half there, that they can divide and conquer. So they're looking at the Hudson River Valley as a absolutely critical strategic point to seize.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today, Professor Kevin J. Weddle. We are discussing his book, The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution. Would it be fair to say the British were feeling pretty good about themselves and what they could accomplish against the rabble, the colonists, based on especially the way they just basically, I hate to say, educated Washington throughout the Battle of New York and everything that was accompanying it. But coming out of that, they had reason, didn't they, to feel like, look, we just need to we need to just keep the pressure on and we'll win this.
I think that's true to an extent, except General Howe, the British commander in chief, he's starting to think that really the only way we're going to win this war is we have to destroy Washington and his army. He's starting to, I think after Trenton and Princeton, he's pretty much come to that conclusion. Before then, I think he thought, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we kicked Washington's tail from, Long Island, Manhattan, all across New Jersey. Yes, he was able to, turn the tide a little bit with Trenton and Princeton, but those are really just kind of just little bloody noses, no big deal. But after that, I think he thought, yes, we've got to destroy Washington and his army. That was not necessarily the feeling throughout the British High Command. I think you had other people like John Burgoyne, as an example, who thought very little of the Americans. He didn't have much respect for Americans or American soldiers. And so he would unfortunately for him, he would learn some lessons after the Saratoga campaign on how good the Americans could fight. But yeah, I think there was some of that in the British High Command.
And how, either despite Mrs. Loring or because of Mrs. Loring, William Howe was someone who was relatively, I've read this in every book, and so correct me if I'm misinterpreting, he was relatively sympathetic with the colonists. At the beginning, let's give them a bloody nose, then they'll come back to the family and we'll figure all this out. And so was his brother, the Admiral Richard Howe. So it wasn't like he was Bannister Tarleton, whacking and killing people up and down the coast. It seems that he gets debited, if that's the right term, with not being as vigorous as he should have been because of this sort of latent sympathy. Fair or unfair?
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think, if you look back and you think well, when could the British have actually won this? A lot of people point to that pursuit across New Jersey, the kind of lackadaisical pursuit across New Jersey, that surely if he had been more aggressive there, he could have run Washington to ground and ended it. And so and yeah, I think I'm not sure he was sympathetic to the American cause, but he was sympathetic to Americans. I think he liked Americans. He had served in America in the Seven Years' War, French and Indian War. His brother had died
That's right.
in that war outside Fort Ticonderoga, actually. And so I think how he liked Americans, he wasn't sympathetic to the revolution, but he did like Americans. I think he thought he understood them. But after Trenton and Princeton, he changes. He clearly changes, and by the time he's getting ready to resign his position as or request relief from his position as general in chief, surely by that time he is absolutely, the only way you're going to win this is a decisive battle against Washington. That's the only way. And I
You
think he
men-
was right.
Agreed. I mean, that comes through in your book. It comes through in other books. I mentioned when we were just chatting, Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy's The Men Who Lost America. That's
Hmm.
I thought, a wonderful treatment of kind of that
It is. Yeah.
argument.
Hmm.
Let's go back. Let's go back to London. You mentioned it because we want to set the stage for the strategy
Sure.
that led to the campaign that became Saratoga.
Right.
Cast of characters is
Yeah.
interesting to say the least.
Very interesting.
What what was happening in Britain at the time, and who was in charge of formulating and implementing a strategy?
Yeah. You're right. This cast of characters are really interesting, and kind of the way they all kind of came together there in early 1777. So the primary fellow in the British government who was responsible for creating the strategy, managing key personnel, managing the war in America was Lord George Germain. And Lord George Germain was Secretary of State for the colonies. He's also you see it you see his title presented differently sometimes. Sometimes Secretary of State for America, Secretary of State for North America. I mean, several different ways that comes across. But his formal title is Secretary of State for the colonies. So he is the guy in charge of that. The king, though, King George III, he plays a role in this. And there's really no like general in chief who he has as his right-hand man to kind of help him do that. But he's a former general. He was a major general during the Seven Years' War. So he's got a lot of military experience himself. He's a very senior guy. So he's certainly very capable. He's got a great work ethic. He's a smart guy. He does not suffer fools gladly, though, and that he has a real hard problem. He has a real problem developing a good personal and professional relationships with some of these key generals that he has to work with. So he's the primary guy, but again, the king is heavily involved. And General John Burgoyne, Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, had just been involved in the aborted invasion from Canada in the fall of 1776. And General Sir Guy Carleton had sent him home back to London with his report to bring his report to the boss. So he does that. So those three people are in London. So you've got the king, Lord George Germain, and John Burgoyne, General John Burgoyne, are there in London. 3,000 miles away is the commander in chief of British forces in North America, excluding Canada, and that's Sir William Howe, and his headquarters is in New York. So again, you got three policymakers right there in London, one policymaker 3,000 miles away. Today, that wouldn't be a big deal. Back then, it was a very big deal
Mm.
because Lord Howe's his brother, Sir William Howe, he's a good 6 to 8 weeks away, one way to get a message to him. So when you're 3,000 miles away and the only way you can get a message is a sailing ship, it can take anywhere, like I said, from 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the winds, the weather, whatever, to get a message one way. And so if you want to reply to that message, back and forth, it could take forever. So now both Burgoyne and Howe will present plans to George Germain. Sir, here's my plan for winning the war. And what the commander-in-chief does, Sir William Howe does, is he presents a plan that says, look, I'm going to take my army. I'm going to take it to Philadelphia, the American capital, nominal American capital, because that's where Congress is sitting. I'm going to take my army to Philadelphia. That's going to lure Washington. He's going to have to defend the capital. That's going to lure Washington out. I'm going to have my decisive battle. We'll win the war. So that's General Howe's strategy. Pretty straightforward. General Burgoyne comes in and he says, I've got an even better plan. And his plan is very complex, very imaginative. It calls for an invasion from Canada again. So similar to what happened in the fall of 1776. But it's going to have three converging columns. And one column is going to come down from Canada, just like they did in 1776. We're going to head south on Lake Champlain, get into the Hudson River Valley. We're going to go all the way down to Albany. Another supporting force is going to go into Lake Ontario and then all the way out to the west, and then come in from the west to the Mohawk River Valley. And they're going to follow the Mohawk River all the way down to Albany and meet up with the northern column coming down from Canada. And then finally, the final piece of this is General Howe with his big army in New York will come up the Hudson River Valley, and all three of those columns will converge on Albany. The idea being, again, you seize control of the Hudson River Valley, you split the more rebellious New England colonies away from the less rebellious, they thought, middle colonies and southern colonies. And then after that, you will conduct some totally unspecified operations into New England for the purpose of pacifying those rebels up there in New England. So two very, very different plans. And so it's up to Germain and, of course, the king, because the king he's got his fingers in all this too. It's up to Germain to reconcile those two plans. So what do I do? Do I pick one plan and go with it? Say, yeah, we're not going to do your plan. We're going to do your plan. This is what we're going to do. Here, all the resources are going to be focused on that plan. But that's not the way that would be the logical thing to do. Pick one and go with it, or, modify it somehow or whatever. But that's not what happens. What ends up happening is Germain and the king will approve Burgoyne's plan, but they will also approve Howe's plan. So they approve both plans, but they tell Howe, okay, once you go to Philadelphia, then once you get done with doing all that, then you go back up the Hudson and you link up with Burgoyne. So because of the distances and time, the time and distance factor between London and New York, Howe doesn't get that second part of the approval until he's already at sea with his army on British transport ships heading toward Philadelphia. So by then it's too late for him to do much of anything except just conduct his Philadelphia campaign. So Burgoyne will end up just having two columns heading toward Albany and not that all-important third column heading up the river, because the third column isn't going up the river. They're heading toward Philadelphia. So you got these two very different campaigns, utterly uncoordinated. And so you have a frittering away of your combat power between these two very different, very large, major campaigns.
Is there anything that resembles an American strategy?
Oh, on the American side, yes, absolutely. So Washington, at the end of 1776, after he basically saves the army, and he's starting to come up with a new military strategy based on his experiences in Boston and New York, and that horrific retreat across New Jersey. Originally, what he did is he followed what would be called at the time a war of posts. And that was, you find important positions and you defend them and you set up, robust defenses and you defend those important posts. And so that worked that worked fairly well up in Boston. Washington, of course, he wasn't there for the Battle of Bunker Hill, Breeds Hill, but he arrived shortly thereafter. In fact, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of Washington's arrival there in Boston, which is also pretty close to the 250th birthday of the U.S. Army, coming up very soon. But Washington arrives there after that takes place. And of course, he hears all about it, that was successful. And then he, of course, besieges Howe's army in Boston, forces them to leave. And so it was a success. So he's looking at that as a success. He goes down to New York. He tries to basically do the same thing, defensive, setting up defensive positions. That does not work well because now Howe is able to maneuver, and he does that very skillfully and totally unhinges what Washington is trying to do. So as Washington is retreating across New Jersey, he starts coming up with this germ of a new strategy, and that is what most historians would call a modified Fabian strategy, named after the famous Roman general during the Punic Wars. And that was keep the army intact at all costs. As long as the army stays intact, the revolution stays intact. If you allow the army to be destroyed or decisively defeated, then the revolution is in deep trouble. So Washington basically said, I am going to keep the army intact, and the only time I'm going to fight a pitched battle is when I have the advantage. Otherwise, I'm going to do some raids and I'm going to do some other things. Trenton and Princeton are great examples of that, and he does it also throughout that winter. Does small raids, but basically keep the army intact. That's what I want to do. And if I can keep the army intact, I can win this thing. There are obviously problems with that. I should say challenges with that, because it almost presupposes that it's going to be a long, protracted war. It's hard to win it's hard to win a short war with that kind of strategy. But I think he understood that was the strategy that he would have to seize on in order to exhaust the British army.
So both the American and the British commands realized that the existence of Washington's army was the revolution.
Yeah, I don't think...
And that may be overstating it, but I'm trying to figure out another way is Howe realized he had to defeat Washington's army to end the war, and Washington realized, as long as I have this army, the war is not over.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. But again, not all the British generals felt that way, though. Howe definitely did, but not all of them did. So I think, Clinton, I don't think Clinton did till later. I think Clinton does later, later in the war. But up to this point, he doesn't. He loves Burgoyne's plan, as a matter of fact, and Clinton is Howe's second in command, and he thinks Clinton's Philadelphia campaign is a total waste of time.
He thinks Howe's Philadelphia campaign
is
a total waste of time.
He thinks that's a total waste of time. Instead, he should have been going up the Hudson. So they have a really hard time getting along.
I'm going to ask you about that here in a few minutes, but I want to bring around to the American sort of tactical command at Saratoga. How is it formed? How does Horatio Gates get to be the commander of the army ultimately at the Battle of Saratoga?
Yeah. Horatio Gates is this really interesting fellow, former British Army officer. He serves in the French and Indian War in America. He likes America. He likes Americans. He serves with Washington during the French and Indian War, serves with a lot of different Americans, the French and Indian War. After the war, French and Indian War, his promotions are coming really, really slowly. He realizes he's not really an aristocrat, so he doesn't think he's really got much of a future in the British Army. So he sells his commission, comes over to the United States, brings his family over to the United States, becomes an American, basically. And so when the war begins, when the American Revolution begins, he's become Americanized. By that time, he offers his services to Washington. Washington gratefully accepts that, just like he does several other former British Army officers, brings Gates in. Gates pretty much very quickly rises to be basically the quartermaster general of the Continental Army. So a very, very important position. So Gates is a really good manager. He understands logistics. He understands terrain pretty well. He's a very much of a kind of a defensive minded general, not really an offensive minded general, but that turns out to be exactly what's needed during the Saratoga campaign, in my view. He also, as the war progresses, he thinks he's a much better general than George Washington is, and he's trying to get an independent command. And they start, even though they get along very well early in the war, they start falling out a bit as the war progresses along. So by the time you get to early 1777, Gates is working for Washington again and looking for an opportunity to go someplace else for an independent command. So during this time, the commander of the Northern Army, responsible for upstate New York, Ticonderoga, Fort Stanwix, there's a bunch of other fortifications up there in upstate New York, is Major General Philip Schuyler. So he is the guy up there. Now Schuyler he's got some complaints that he wants to file against Congress. So he, like a lot of these guys, they have very thin skins. They feel, any sort of criticism they take personally. And so he leaves his post up there in New York, goes down to Philadelphia to basically complain to Congress about how he's been treated. In the meantime, Congress sends Gates up to take command of Fort Ticonderoga. Now, Gates had been in command of Fort Ticonderoga in 1776. So they send him up there to take command of Fort Ticonderoga again, to continue to prepare its defenses for a likely second invasion from Canada. So Gates sees this great opportunity and a vacuum that's up there in New York because Schuyler has left his command. And so Gates basically goes to Albany and takes over, takes over the northern department in Schuyler's absence. Not what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to be up at Ticonderoga, but instead he sort of takes over. Congress doesn't, they don't really chastise him for that. Neither does Washington, but he basically takes control in Schuyler's absence. That's a problem, I think. I talk about this at some length in the book because I think because it wasn't really clear who was in charge up there. So you didn't really have really good unity of command up there. And I think the defense of Ticonderoga will suffer because of that, because of the lack of attention that Ticonderoga received during the whole springtime of 1777. Well, Congress finally steps in and they basically say, okay, Gates, thank you for helping out up there for a couple months, but we really need you at Ticonderoga, and we're sending Schuyler back up there to take overall command again. Well, Gates is incensed about this and he refuses to take Ticonderoga, and he basically goes back home. So Schuyler's up there taking command of Ticonderoga and the whole department up there. And so when Burgoyne heads south from Canada, it's Schuyler who's in command up there. So when Burgoyne does come down and he seizes Ticonderoga after just a couple days, almost without firing a shot, it's a huge shock to the Americans. They had been led to believe that Ticonderoga was impregnable. Washington was led to believe that. Congress was led to believe that. And instead, it falls, like I said, in a matter of days. And they put all the blame on two men. They put it on Schuyler, because he's the overall department commander, and the guy who's actually in command at Ticonderoga, which at the time was Arthur Sinclair, Major General Arthur Sinclair. So while the campaign is progressing, Burgoyne has seized Ticonderoga, and then he starts moving very, very slowly farther south, heading toward Albany. Congress, after Schuyler during this period, is writing letter after letter to Congress in Washington bemoaning his fate up there, basically saying that the sky is falling, the troops are panicking. There's no way he can defend upstate New York. Burgoyne's going to have free reign all the way down to the Hudson River. There's nothing he can do. Finally, after getting letter after letter like that, Congress relieves Schuyler and they appoint General Gates in his place.
When does Burgoyne leave Canada for his American invasion?
He leaves, well, let's see. He leaves in late June and he leaves in, I should know this date exactly, but sometime in early June. And then he starts heading south. And by the time he gets to it's the 2nd of July, he's just outside of Fort Ticonderoga.
And Fort Ticonderoga falls early July.
It falls on the 6th of July. Right, right. So just like I said, just in a matter of a couple days. And Ticonderoga was a really important post. It had been for a long time. It had been called, the French had built it. It was called Fort Carillon when they built it. The British take it. They rename it Fort Ticonderoga. The Americans keep the same name once they seize it. And Ticonderoga is really important because it's right there where Lake George and there's the Lachute River basically runs from Lake George into Lake Champlain. So it's right where Lake Champlain and Lake George come together. And of course, just south of that is the Hudson River. So that's why it's such an important invasion route. So Ticonderoga lies right astride that invasion route. So if you wanna have any sort of invasion, either north or south into Canada or into upstate New York, you have to control Fort Ticonderoga or else your lines of communications are not going to be secure.
Briefly, you mentioned how impregnable it was thought to be, yet it folded in just a few days. Why?
Yeah, well, this comes down to terrain and paying attention to detail. If you look at Fort Ticonderoga, if you look at a map of Fort Ticonderoga, just go and look on Google Maps and do the satellite view. You can look down at Fort Ticonderoga, and just to the southwest of Fort Ticonderoga is a very, very tall hill called Mount Defiance, also called the Sugarloaf. It was about 850 feet above sea level, and the fort itself was less than 200 feet above sea level. So it dominates the fort. You can almost look down into the fort if you're on top of Mount Defiance. In fact, today there's a path. You can go up to it. There's a little picnic spot on the top of Mount Defiance, and you can stand up there and you can look right down into the fort. And so at the time, both in 1776 and then into 1777, there was a series of engineers who had told the American commanders, you've got to put something up there on Mount Defiance. If nothing else, put a company of infantrymen up there just to keep, to secure it. Because if the enemy gets a hold of that, they can observe everything we're doing if they can do that. But none of these commanders took that advice, and so Mount Defiance is totally unsecured by the Americans. And so when the British get there and they start moving around, the American defenses, outside the American defenses, the British saw this hill. And Burgoyne was fortunate that his second in command was this veteran artilleryman, Major General Phillips, really solid commander. And he saw that hill and he said, wow, if I can get guns up there, we're going to be in great shape. And one of his, there's this great story that one of his staff officers said, well, sir, a goat couldn't get up that hill. Or you need to be a goat to get up on top of that hill. And Philip supposedly said, well, where a goat can go, a man can go, or where a man can go, he can drag a gun. And that's what they do. They go up this very, very steep hill. In fact, if you just walk the paved path today, it's very, very steep, and you'll be winded by the time you get to the top of this hill. But they had to go through the woods. They basically bushwhacked a trail through the woods, got an entire artillery battery, dragged it up on top of the hill, and started lobbing shells into the center of Fort Ticonderoga and Fort Independence, which is just on the other side across the lake from Fort Ticonderoga. And as soon as that happened, Major General Arthur Sinclair, the commander at Fort Ticonderoga, said, "Whoops, we got to get out of here." So he ordered an evacuation, a very poorly executed and planned evacuation.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies. Our guest today, Professor Kevin J. Weddle. We are discussing his terrific book, The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution. I mentioned a few minutes ago, the British government had quite a cast of characters helping along, doing things. The American Army had an even more delightful cast of characters.
It did.
You discussed St. Clair and Schuyler, who, I don't think crucial to the battle that we're going to discuss. Obviously, Gates was, but who else was there? Most famously, Benedict Arnold.
Right.
But I have to say, and Daniel Morgan, who commanded my all-time favorite battle, and that's Cowpens in January of 1781.
Yep.
But the Americans had someone else, and it stuck out in my mind only because we have a county in Indiana named after him.
Oh.
Thaddeus Kosciuszko.
Oh, well, at West Point, I was always told that you pronounce it Kosciuszko, but I don't know.
Well, in Indiana, we also say Versailles, so you get what you get instead of Versailles.
Sure.
So, who are some of the secondary subordinate commanders for General Gates who really play a critical role in what is eventually an American victory?
Yes. Well, you just named several of the really important ones. Obviously, Benedict Arnold, incredibly dynamic, aggressive commander. Troops loved him, but he was incredibly thin-skinned. He was, mercurial. He was tough to get along with. But Gates and Arnold get along very, very well in the 1776 campaign. And in fact, when Arnold finds out that Gates has replaced Schuyler, he writes this wonderful letter to Gates saying, "Oh man, this is great. We're back together again. You're fantastic. I can't wait till you get up here. We're going to show those British." Just as this great letter. So you have Benedict Arnold. You've got General, oh gosh.
Nathaniel Greene?
No, Green isn't.
Daniel Morgan?
Well, Colonel Daniel Morgan. So as you already mentioned him, of course, Daniel Morgan is absolutely, again, this wonderful commander, a lot of experience, French and Indian War, early in, he's in the Canadian expedition, and he commands the riflemen, and I always kind of compare the riflemen to like special forces or Delta Force or something like that. He's it's for the time, it was a very, very elite unit, and there was only one of them. Everybody wanted Daniel Morgan's riflemen. And Washington very unselfishly sends Daniel Morgan and his riflemen up to the Northern Army to help reinforce them. So he's up there. He's an outstanding commander. Thaddeus Kosciuszko, this outstanding engineer, one of the most brilliant military engineers, he's one of those engineers who told St. Clair, you got to fortify Mount Defiance. He's also the man who chose Bemis Heights as the place where the Americans could best defend the route that heads towards Albany. So Washington is really, really important in that he's sending all these really important leaders up to help out at the time Schuyler before Gates takes over. So he sends Arnold up there, he sends Morgan up there, he sends other reinforcements up there. And one of the most important things he does is send these senior leaders up there that are gonna, at the time, I think he was hoping would kind of put some steel in Schuyler's backbone, but they turn out to play a large role in the overall campaign. Two other guys that I would mention who are really important to the American cause, but they weren't at Saratoga, they were at Fort Stanwix, and that is Colonel Peter Gant and his second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Willett. These two very young officers. I think Gansevoort, if I'm not mistaken, was something like 26 years old, 26-year-old full colonel. And he was the basically the commander at Fort Stanwix, and they were really the only thing that was stopping the supporting force that was coming down the Mohawk River Valley to join up with Burgoyne there at Fort Stanwix, like a small little fort. And he basically holds off an organization that's three times his size for 22 days, a 22-day siege. Just does an absolutely brilliant job. So a great contrast between what happens at Fort Ticonderoga, where the Americans give up after 3 days, and Colonel Peter Gansevoort and Colonel Willett holding out at Fort Stanwix for throughout a 24 or 22-day siege. Really great examples of leadership there.
Grip.
Pardon?
Of grip.
Of grip, absolutely. Yeah. Certainly I can, somebody like Gansevoort, he, before the British even arrive, they know they're coming. And Gansevoort, again, if you look at sort of my conception of grip, he's thinking ahead. Okay, what do I need to do to be successful if these guys arrive and, they lay siege to my fort? Well, I've got to have a source of clean drinking water. And it can't be outside the fort. It's got to be inside the fort. So he digs a well inside the fort that it hadn't been done before. Previously, they had gone outside for their drinking water. Well, now, so he does all that beforehand. He obstructs the routes leading toward the fort to slow down the advance. So he's got more time to prepare. He's stockpiling food and ammunition. He's doing all these things ahead of time. So by the time the British general arrives with his force, a guy named Barry St. Leger, once they arrive, Gansevoort's ready to go. And so what St. Leger's intelligence had told him was this is going to be this rundown fortification that probably won't even be manned. He finds that it's manned by this small but very plucky American garrison commanded by a very, dynamic, tough, young American officer. And they do a brilliant job.
Let's move into the fall of 1777 for the battles, but I want to branch off for just 1 second. To me, the Battle of Cowpens, which is January 17th, 1781, down in the Carolinas, is the most important small battle in the history of the United States. We can fight about that another time.
Sure.
But just what happened, how it happened, what it led to. But I had completely forgotten about this. You could make the case, and I'm asking you to make the case that I'm wrong, that the Battle of Bennington is the most important sort of, non-large scale, non-Saratoga, a small scale battle that happens right there, right when Saratoga is being conceived and executed. Tell us not only about the Battle of Bennington, why it's important, but the grippy general who led the Americans.
Yes. Yeah, the battle, you could make that argument. You absolutely could make that argument. So as Burgoyne is moving south from Ticonderoga, he's heading toward Albany. And as he's continuing to move down, despite the fact that Schuyler is sending all these panicking messages, he's actually doing a pretty good job of kind of reconstituting the army after the loss of Ticonderoga. He's slowing down Burgoyne as he's moving south, so he's delaying him through raids and obstructing the route and all these other different things. And so Burgoyne is moving painfully slowly as he's heading south. And Burgoyne starts running into big time logistical problems. He has left Canada without enough logistical support knowingly, and he does that because he thinks he can get loyalists to fill the vacuum. That doesn't happen though. So
it never happens.
It never happens. No.
Even when Lee's marching through Maryland, Antietam and Gettysburg, they're gonna flock to our standard, and they never do.
Nope.
Anyway,
nope.
Forgive me my explosion.
No, you are exactly right. And that was a major assumption that Burgoyne made, it hinged on, I need this assumption to be true in order for us to be successful. But it's not true. And so he's able to get a little bit of support, but not nearly enough. So as he's heading south, they hear a rumor that there are cattle and oxen and horses and carts, all the stuff he needs is at Bennington, Vermont. So he goes, well, okay, we got plenty of time to get to Albany. We've got time. So he stops at Fort Edward and he sends a 1,000 man detachment. That's a big detachment out of an army when by this time, he's only got 7,000 guys at this point, a little bit more maybe. He sends a 1,000 man detachment to Bennington. They were going to seize that stuff, bring it back, and then he'd have plenty of logistical support now to make that final push down to Albany. So this 1,000 man detachment starts off. They start heading toward Albany, and they are intercepted by a primarily, almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely militia force led by a New Hampshire man named John Stark, Brigadier General John Stark. And John Stark leads this, again, mostly militia force against this 1,000 man British. It's actually mostly German troops that he sends down there, but there are a lot of British with him too. But he basically annihilates this British column, Burgoyne's column. When I say annihilate, not killed, the vast majority of them are captured. But basically, Burgoyne in one day loses 1,000 men. And those are 1,000 men that he can ill afford to lose because he's not getting any reinforcements. And so he loses these 1,000 men, and he also doesn't get all the logistics support that he wanted. So it's a two-for whammy. And the Americans do this incredibly brilliant job against this detachment, and that's at the Battle of Bennington. So yeah, it's a huge blow for Burgoyne. And at this point, you've got to say, okay, what are you going to do, General Burgoyne? I mean, do I keep going toward Albany because that's how my orders read? Or do I look at what's happened? And that is, I've just lost 1,000 guys. I have these horrific logistical problems, and now that I've lost these 1,000 guys, I even have more logistical problems. And now I've lost, 1,000 men combat power as well. Am I going to have enough combat power to get where I need to go? And by the way, it looks like the Americans have recovered from the shock of losing Ticonderoga. And do I continue on, or do I concentrate on saving the army at this point? And he continues on.
Was that, and I've got three sort of rapid fire questions because I want to give you some time to go through Miss Heights and Freeman's Farm in September and October of 77. I've actually been there and it's fabulous. And I went during the time of the battle, which is when you should go.
Right.
And I was lucky for beautiful weather. But that aside, Burgoyne decides to keep going. Was that in part fueled by the failure of the previous year? And he didn't want to be seen as a failure. And, he was a relatively ambitious, critical man, especially of fellow generals. That's one. Second thing, and you take such great pains to detail this in your book, the confusion about what the generals could do as opposed to what the strategy dictated that they could do was a huge factor in the American win. Specifically, is Hal going to go help Burgoyne, or is he just going to stay in Philadelphia? And that to me is one of the best parts of your book. I mean, we all say the fog of war. We always say amateurs talk strategy, experts talk logistics, but they never really figured that out. So that's kind of two questions. One is previous failure in Albany. Second was sort of this strategic confusion.
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple things that play into his decision to keep going. I wouldn't doubt if that's part of it. I mean, he was a very ambitious guy. He had bitterly criticized his commander for not continuing the fight in the previous fall. So that may have played into it. This was also, even though he's a very senior officer in the British Army, this is his first independent command. And so I think, in that respect, he was kind of falling back on, well, you know, I've never been in this
Hmm.
situation before. I'm in the middle of the wilderness. I don't have anybody that I can ask advice to. There's nobody around that I can talk to about this. So what do I fall back to? I fall back to my orders. And my orders say, continue on to Albany. As far as the confusion about how coming up the river goes, by the time he gets to Bennington, he absolutely knows that Howe isn't coming. Howe has told him that. In fact, as early as April, Howe told him, "I'm not coming up the river. I'm going to Albany." And later on, Burgoyne will testify in front of Parliament that, yeah, I know he told me that, but I didn't believe him. I knew they were going to tell him he needed to go up the Hudson, but he never did that due diligence. You and I mean, you were in the army, I was in the army. If you get a message that is totally kind of out of whack from what you think is supposed to happen, what do you usually do? You kind of you follow up and you say, is this really right? I mean, are you sure now? Is this correct? But of course, he never did any of that due diligence. So yeah, there was confusion, but most of that confusion was early on. By the time he gets to Bennington, he knows Howe isn't coming.
All the times I used to say, Sergeant, say again. Captain, say again. The battles of Saratoga. And we could talk a little bit, maybe weave this in if you want, with Henry Clinton, who's in New York City. He's maybe
Mhm.
trying to help Burgoyne a little bit.
Yeah,
But September 19th, October 7th, I believe are the dates.
right,
Freeman's Farm is on September 19th,
right,
and Bemis Heights is on October 7th.
right,
So if you could take just a couple of minutes on each, obviously Bemis Heights is somewhat more important, but
right.
they complement each other for sure.
They do for sure. So Freeman's Farm is the first battle, as you said. After Bennington, Burgoyne has to wait to gather enough supplies to keep going. So he keeps going. Finally, he pushes across over to the west bank of the Hudson River. He does that because that's really the only route that he can take. There's no road network that heads toward Albany on the east side, so he's got to go over to the west side. That's how he's going to get to Albany. In the meantime, Gates had moved the army up. He has taken command. He's moved the army up. He has set up defensive positions along Bemis Heights, where that is Colonel Kosciuszko had identified as the best defensive terrain. So Gates is basically waiting for Burgoyne. So on the 19th of September, Burgoyne basically breaks his army into three columns. He's going to basically try to fix Gates in place and then try to get around his Gates's left flank. That's the idea anyway. Excuse me. But by this time, all of Burgoyne's Indian Native American allies have deserted him. So they kind of acted as his cavalry. So he would send those guys out, do recons, all that stuff. They're pretty much gone. So Gates has a pretty good picture on what's developing, whereas Burgoyne really doesn't have a good picture of what's in front of him. So as the columns are making their way south, Gates is able to kind of figure out where they're going, and he sends out Morgan's riflemen along with Dearborn's light infantrymen who work in concert with the riflemen. Send those guys out first, and that's what kicks off the Battle of Freeman's Farm. It's a bitter battle. There's a lot of heavy fighting basically in the middle of those three columns. That's where Morgan hits them, and basically the rest of the fight takes place right there in the middle. The other columns will kind of converge, or elements of the other columns will converge and fight there. The British basically win, I use quotation marks, win the Battle of Freeman's Farm because they hold on to the battlefield, but they suffer about three times the amount of casualties that the Americans suffer at Freeman's Farm. When these two armies clash at Freeman's Farm on the 19th of September, they're about even, little over 6,000 men on both sides. So evenly matched fight, tough fight. But now after that, you got to ask yourself again. I'm General Burgoyne. What do I do now? I couldn't get past the Americans. They proved to be pretty tough. I just fought a really tough battle. I suffered lots of casualties. And what am I going to do now? So he decides to dig in. So you've got the Americans dug in on Bemis Heights. You've got Burgoyne dug in across the fields and ravines from Gates, north of Gates. And in the meantime, there are messages that are going back between Burgoyne and General Clinton, who was back in New York City. Now, General Clinton was Howe's second in command. So when Howe leaves New York to go to Philadelphia, he leaves General Clinton behind with a skeleton force. And he tells Clinton, look, your mission is to defend New York City, defend our base. But if reinforcements come in, which they're supposed to come in, and you think you have the troops you need, if you want to make a little demonstration in Burgoyne's favor, go ahead and do that. So in the meantime, Clinton, all the reports that he'd received from Burgoyne was things are going swimmingly, everything's going great. And then he gets a report from Burgoyne saying, I am in deep trouble. Just kind of out of the blue. And this was after that Battle of Freeman's Farm. And so Clinton says, well, geez, okay. So he scrapes together a force and he gets some Royal Navy support and they go up the river. They're able to capture the American Forts Clinton, no relation, Fort Clinton and Fort Montgomery, which is just south of West Point today. They were guarding the entrance into the Hudson Highlands. He seizes those forts and then they continue on. But they never get closer than about 70 miles to Burgoyne. But Burgoyne thinks Clinton is coming up, so he decides to basically hunker down and wait for Clinton to come up and basically save him.
Before you get to Bemis Heights, I'm glad that you mentioned the Native Americans. They were a huge part, both sort of emotionally and tactically for the British. And I loved this part of your book. As the Native Americans vanish, the American militia starts to appear. Yeah. The news of how things are going and that Gates is holding his own, Bennington's a victory. Hey, pick up your musket and head to the battlefield, march to the sound of the guns and see if you can be helpful. That really starts to be, I hate to use the word dispositive again, but that's the word I can think of.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of things that play into this rush of militia to join the American army. One of the big things is those reinforcements that Washington has sent to Schuyler/Gates. Remember I said Benedict Arnold, the general I couldn't remember right away was Benjamin Lincoln. So Washington sends Benedict Arnold and Benjamin Lincoln up there. One of the reasons he sends those two in particular, not only that they're good guys, but they're also very, very militia friendly. Militia likes them. They like the militia. New Englanders like them. They like New Englanders. In fact, Benjamin Lincoln he's a Bostonian. So they had hated Schuyler. Militia did not like Schuyler at all. The New Englanders despised Schuyler. So he sends these guys up there to help bring the militia in. Same with Gates. Gates is one of those very unusual former British officers who, again, likes Americans and he likes the American militia and he knows how to use them. So that combined with those victories that you talked about, the Bennington victory, the fact that Stanwix's victory, the victory at Fort Stanwix, that also played into it. American militia starts to flock toward the American army. So by the time you get to the Battle of Bemis Heights, which is only just a couple weeks after the Battle of Freeman's Farm, you now have the American army has swollen to about 11,000. We're not sure exactly because the militia is a little tough to know, but it was probably at least 11,000 by that time. And Burgoyne he's got about 6,000. So where the two armies were evenly matched at the Battle of Freeman's Farm, now Gates drastically outnumbers General Burgoyne. So at the Battle of Bemis Heights, again, interesting battle, very interesting battle, because you got a lot of these dynamics. One of the biggest dynamics is the falling out between Gates and Benedict Arnold. So Benedict Arnold is Gates' second in command at the Battle of Freeman's Farm. They have a falling out after the battle. Remember, they were pretty close. They had gotten along pretty well. But after Freeman's Farm, they have this big falling out. They have this very juvenile, quarrel goes on where they're screaming obscenities at each other, and then it kind of degenerates into this, just sending letters back and forth, and their headquarters are only half a mile apart. And they're just, I mean, when you read the letters, and I quote a lot of the letters in my book, it's just, it really is a juvenile exchange between these two senior officers. But through some new scholarship that's come out and combined with some old scholarship, basically what's happened is they come back together. They're able to work together again by the time it gets to the Battle of Bemis Heights. Now, what happens there is Burgoyne has been waiting in vain for Clinton to show up to help him out. He has drastically reduced his rations because they're running out of food, they're running out of fodder. So he basically decides on a desperate gamble, and that is he's going to personally lead this 1,300 man, basically reconnaissance force out of their fortifications. They're going to try to find number one, they're going to try to find some food, scrounge for some food. And number two, to see if maybe they can find a route that would get them past Gates's army and be able to continue on down to Albany. And now, of course, you're getting into October. It's getting cold. In the evening, there's frost forming. So these guys, they've seen the gamut from, hot, humid, rainy.
Bugs.
Now it's getting
Bugs.
cold. Bugs. Oh my God. You should read all the accounts of all the soldiers, American, British, German, talking about the bugs. And of course, anybody who goes up to New York State, that part of New York State in the summertime, there's lots of bugs. So
the common enemy, it came through in your book. Is it fair to say that Bemis Heights is it two things? One is famously Gates knew Burgoyne, or knew enough of him to predict this sort of gamble, called him an old gamester, and he's willing to throw everything, or to stake everything on one throw.
Yeah.
And B, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, and Burgoyne was known throughout the British Army as being he did gamble. I mean, he liked to go to gaming, places and gamble. So he was known for that. And he was a cavalryman, very aggressive kind of guy. I don't know your experience in the Army, but my experience with cavalrymen they're pretty aggressive, pretty aggressive guys. And that's a good thing. That's what you want with a cavalryman. But yeah, so he makes this gamble, and he personally leads this huge reconnaissance force out there. And almost immediately, again, Gates spots the movement, and he's able to send out again. He sends out Morgan's riflemen and Dearborn's light infantry, sends out another brigade. They immediately start picking off the officers. In fact, Burgoyne's best general, Brigadier General Simon Fraser, is shot down very, very quickly. So his best guy, his most aggressive, his Benedict Arnold, if you will, is out of the fight. He's mortally wounded. He dies the next day. And he's out, and the entire reconnaissance force just degenerates into a rabble because his messengers are shot down, and they don't get the word to fall back, and it's just an utter disaster. And all this time, Benedict Arnold is kind of supervising the fight. He sees what's going on. He rides back to Gates back at Bemis Heights. He says, "Hey, give me some more men, and I think I can win this thing." And Gates does. He sends out another brigade plus out with Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold personally leads these guys into a German fortification on the far right flank of Burgoyne's army. He seizes the fortification. Unfortunately for Benedict Arnold, he's shot down, very seriously wounded, but he survives, but very seriously wounded in this attack. But by the end of the day, as the sun is setting, the Americans have seized this kind of impregnable position on the far right of Burgoyne's line, and Burgoyne has no choice. He has to fall back at that point because with the Americans on his flank, there's nothing else he can do. And so that's what he does.
When and why, or why and when, did the surrender of Burgoyne's army happen?
So after he falls back, the next day he he decides that he has to actually retreat back toward Ticonderoga. So he starts falling back the next day. So on the 8th, he starts moving north. There's a torrential rainfall that occurs, and you know is a total disaster for his retreat. And they basically his exhausted army grinds to a halt just about 9 miles north of the Bemis Heights battlefield at a little tiny hamlet, little place called Saratoga. And they grind to a halt there. Gates follows up. By this time, Gates's army, by the time he catches up to Burgoyne's army, by this time Gates's army is a good 16,000 strong because again, more and more militia are pouring in. And within the matter of a couple days, Gates has totally surrounded Burgoyne's army. At that point, Burgoyne, there's no way he can get back across the river and start heading back toward the safety of Fort Ticonderoga. And the Americans start bombarding. Americans aren't very good with artillery at this point, but even they could hit Burgoyne's guys across the way. So they start bombarding Burgoyne's camp, and Burgoyne finally sends a flag of truce across and asks for discussion of terms.
And we could do a whole podcast on what those terms were.
We could.
But let's move forward. I want to be conscious of your time.
Sure.
And what are the ramifications of the British surrender, and what are the ramifications of the American victory? Because I read Stacy Schiff's book, The Great Improvisation, about what was going on in Europe at the time. Explain to the Leaders and Legends podcast audience what Saratoga meant to the American revolutionary effort.
Well, for a long time, Americans have been looking for a European ally. And so we sent a diplomatic mission to France in particular, trying to get the French to come over on our side. And this diplomatic mission is led by Benjamin Franklin. So he had been working hard to get the French to support. The French want to support us. They support us covertly for quite some time, but they can't overtly yet. And so they want proof that the Americans have staying power. And after the loss of Fort Ticonderoga, it certainly didn't look like we had staying power. And in fact, the British diplomats really make great hay with the loss of Fort Ticonderoga in July of 1777. But with the victory at Saratoga and the loss of a British army, so that is unprecedented, the loss of a British army. So they lose an entire British army, and this news arrives in London on the 2nd of December. It arrives in Paris on the 4th of December, so 2 days apart. Benjamin Franklin gets word of the great American victory at Ticonderoga or at Saratoga, and the French almost immediately reopen negotiations. And in a matter of just weeks, we have signed two treaties: a treaty of amity and commerce and a treaty of alliance with the French. And that takes place in early February of 1778, all because of the American victory at Saratoga. And
what happens? Go ahead.
Well, it's an earth-shattering thing because now the British are faced not just with a regional, kind of a localized war against these former British citizens. Now with the French coming in, you're talking about a global war. You're talking about a war now where the British have to defend their interests in in the Far East, at Gibraltar, in the West Indies, Canada. And so, it becomes a global conflict for them instead of this localized one. In fact, when the British in early 1778 in the wake of Saratoga, when they're trying to figure out a new strategy now, they and the French, they haven't heard yet that the French have come in. They're talking about if the French do come in, the Americans are going to be a secondary theater now. And of course they do, and we do become what's really a secondary theater.
Well, and the for context, the British had just utterly pounded the French in the 7 Years' War. They had this, remarkable streak of military victories. I mean, Duke of Marlborough, the list goes on and on through these other
Sure.
conflicts.
Yeah.
So to lose an entire British army to a group of colonists, it's one thing to lose them to the French or the Austrians or the Russians, perhaps,
Yeah.
but
Yes.
to lose them to the colonists is, to your point, shocking. Howe, Burgoyne, George III, Germain, Lord North, who's the prime minister. How do they react? If you can put that in one little bundle.
Yeah. Well, Burgoyne, of course, he's been captured. Washington allows him to go home. So he basically gives him his authorization to go home. He does. He's blaming everybody, takes no responsibility whatever, he blames his German allies, he blames Germain, he blames Howe. He blames just about everybody but Clinton, who did try to help him. Blames Carleton, blames everybody. So he's basically out of the army after that. General Howe, he doesn't think he's given enough credit for seizing Philadelphia, the American capital. So he's kind of he's kind of miffed after that. He submits his resignation as commander in chief. It's accepted. He's replaced by his former second in command, General Clinton. So Howe comes home. He stays in the army though and continues to serve. Germain gets just raked over the coals in Parliament. I talk about that at some length. So does Lord North. Both of them just get absolutely raked over the coals. North begs King George III to accept his resignation. George III refuses to accept his resignation. He also keeps Germain on. In fact, he keeps Germain on all the way through Yorktown when Germain finally is fired. King George III, according to Horace Walpole, he fell over in agonies when he learned the news. Walpole was famous for exaggeration, so we're not quite sure if he actually collapsed, but he was very, very upset about it.
Is it fair to say? Is it fair to say that Saratoga was the high point for both Gates and Arnold? And therefore, what happens next, including the cabal to push aside General Washington, is somewhat ironic, maybe?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely no doubt that Saratoga was the high point for both of those men. And it's funny because I try to be scrupulously fair, especially to Gates. I've been accused mainly on Amazon reviews, but I've been accused of being a Gates lover and a Gates apologist, but I don't think I am. I think Gates had the right skill set for what was needed at the time. If he needed something more, he wasn't the guy, and he proved that at the Battle of Camden later on. Yeah, so definitely Saratoga is the high point for Gates and Arnold.
You get 30 seconds. You get 30 seconds. Defend Benedict Arnold.
Defend Benedict Arnold from what am I supposed to defend him from? He was a traitor. I'm not going to defend him from that. Absolutely. He deserves everything he got for being a traitor. But I don't think he can. So many historians say he won the battle in spite of Gates. I don't think so. I think they were a good team. Gates deserves to be the victor of Saratoga because he was the guy in command, but he had a really, really important assist from that very aggressive, outstanding combat commander, Benedict Arnold.
We started the podcast, and we're going to get to the 5 questions here in just a second. The 5 questions we ask all of our guests. But Saratoga, this is what we started the podcast with an hour ago. To me, it's the most important battle in the history of the United States, land or sea. How wrong or right am I?
I think you can absolutely make that case that Saratoga was the most important battle. Certainly, Sir Henry Cressy, who wrote the 15 decisive battles of the world, picked Saratoga as one of his 15 decisive battles, and he was a Brit, and he wrote that in 1851, something like that. You could also, and you and I were talking about before we started talking about Saratoga, before we started the podcast, we were talking about U.S. Grant. You could also make a case that the greatest, most impressive campaign, maybe might not most decisive, was Grant at Vicksburg. I think you could make that case too.
Would you like to join me in my crusade to convince people that Gettysburg is an overrated battle?
Uh, I I still think Gettysburg is pretty important. It is overrated when you compare it to Vicksburg, though.
And Shiloh. We've reached the point on the we'll do another podcast, Professor.
Okay.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Are you ready, sir?
Sure.
What was your first job?
My first job, I was a caddy.
For the Dalai Lama?
No, no, I wish. No, there was a fancy country club about a mile from our house, and so that's that I never could join or play for with or at, but I caddied there.
What was your first concert?
Concert. I wasn't a concert guy. I didn't go to concerts. My most recent concert is my wife and I went to see EOL. ELO. EOL.
Got it.
ELO.
I
Yeah,
heard that's a wonderful. I didn't go. They were in Indianapolis, and I didn't go. I heard it was a wonderful show.
they were fabulous.
Jeff
Yeah.
Lindsay, LO. Number
Yeah.
3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh, any book. Well, the book that really got me fired up for history was serious history was when I read Grant's memoirs.
Mm.
I think Grant's memoirs are brilliant.
I have a copy of Grant's memoirs signed by George Will and George F. Will. And when I asked him to sign it, he looked at me and goes, "I would, of all the books I've ever written, this is the book I wish I would have written."
Yeah,
It is brilliant.
it is.
And
Yeah.
brilliant. It's brilliantly written. I mean, not
Yeah.
just the fact that it's Grant's memoir. It's just that the
Right.
writing is so
Right.
crisp and terrific.
Clear and just like he wrote his orders.
That's right. Did you read? I think it's called Grant's Final Victory.
I have not. I know of
It's
that book, but I have not.
it's really good. You would enjoy it. It's
I'm
it's
sure I would.
obviously very sympathetic. It's
Yeah.
Charles Brayson Flood, I think, wrote
I
it,
think that's right. Yeah.
and I enjoyed it immensely. Sorry,
Yeah.
a 4th question.
Hmm.
If you could, this is a tough one. Sorry.
Uh-oh.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which
Oh.
event would you choose?
Hmm. Hmm. I would love to have sat in with Winston Churchill and FDR on some of their private conversations when they didn't have anybody else in the room. And that happened a lot when Churchill visited Washington when he visited Washington D.C. right after Pearl Harbor,
And December of 41, yeah.
December of 41. Yep. Washington. I have 4 heroes. It's Washington, Lincoln, Grant, and Churchill.
Not a bad Mount Rushmore.
Yep.
Hopefully you would keep your clothes on,
Yes. Yes.
unlike
yes.
Mr. Churchill.
Yes. Yes. I would toss him a robe.
Number 5, last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Living today. Oh goodness. Today. Hmm. Hmm. And this is not a political statement by any stretch, but I think it would be really interesting. I think it'd be fun and enlightening to sit down with Elon Musk and have dinner with him. And this is it's not a political endorsement or an attack. It's just I think that would be really interesting.
His brilliance and his grip are unassailable.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran-owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister, who lived to be 101, but was not at the Battle of Saratoga. He was at the invasion of North Africa, though, in November of 42. Our guest today, Kevin J. Weddle, author of The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution. If you want to know why we won the American Revolution, you can't know without reading this book. It takes you through the battles, the personalities, the strategies, the luck, the courage, all the things that were needed to lead to October 19th, 1781, and the surrender at Yorktown. Mr. Weddle, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Robert. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.